When the Formula One World Championship first started, pit stops were only carried out by necessity and weren't normally a part of a winning strategy. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine a Formula One Grand Prix without pit stops. In this video, we're gonna go over how pit stops evolved throughout the years, along with how it became the center point of strategic battles between different teams and drivers alike. Let's start by taking a look at what was a typical Formula One pit stop at the time it was introduced.
Time to refuel and change tires.
I think you will agree that it was quite different than one from today. You only had a few mechanics working on the car at a time, getting it fixed and ready to go back on track with nothing more than the essential tools for the job. Their goal was to get it done. Get it done as fast as they could, because back then, having to perform a pit stop was more of a setback than it was a strategy.
One eternity later.
The tires are changed at last. A crewman polishes the windshield as Holland moves away just 67 seconds after he stopped.
The first time a pit stop was included in an actual winning strategy was during the 1957 German Grand Prix, where Juan Manuel Fangio won after stopping for fuel and tires mid-race. However, the strategy was poorly executed. That pit stop did not go particularly well for Fangio, and he would have probably won the race without it anyway. This might explain why no other team tried using similar strategies for another 25 years. When the 70s came around, Formula One started to look more and more like the spectacle it is today. Aerodynamics suddenly became a thing, and bigger engines were being used, so the cars were getting faster, quite a bit faster. Thanks to quicker cars and faster racing, pit stops became a must, and soon they turned into an essential part of any winning strategy. This time around, there were more mechanics working on the car while it was stopped, and they had at their disposal more advanced technologies, like for example, the wheel gun, that was invented to substitute the almighty hammer. Both these factors, along with some others, contributed for quicker and quicker pit stops. However, at its core, very little had actually changed over the years. You still had to change tires, perform minor repair work, and you always had the classic visor or windscreen wiping. Brabham was one of the first teams to use thirsty turbo engines in the 80s, and they calculated that running with half a tank and then performing a mid-race pit stop for refueling would be a lot faster than running the entire race with the extra fuel load needed for their engines. They tried this tactic for the first time in 1982, being unsuccessful at first because of the sheer unreliability of their cars during the first few races. However, during the 1982 Austrian Grand Prix, their first successful refueling pit stop finally came through. Riccardo Patrese was in the lead. He had built quite some margin due to his car being lighter, since he was carrying less fuel. He pitted. They changed his tires, pumped some fuel into his car using a highly sophisticated system that included a fuel hose and some pressurized air tanks. He then came out of the pits, and to everyone's surprise, he was still in the lead. This was the first time anybody had ever done that in Formula One, intentionally running low on fuel just to pit halfway through the race to fuel up, and to still have a time advantage over the rest of the grid. History was made that day. Unfortunately for Brabham, Patrese spun and crashed a couple of laps later, but their actions echoed within the world of Formula One. At the very first Grand Prix of the following season in Brazil, Nelson Piquet finally took home a victory for Brabham, after spending the first 40 laps of the race pulling out a margin, to then stop for fuel and come back on track ahead of everybody else, and this time actually win. It was the first time since Fangio that a driver had won by using this strategy, and once again, history was made. But perhaps even more interesting was that Williams, during that same race, also tried to refuel their car, and it caught on fire as a result. This was but the start of an alarming trend in 1983, as teams tried to gain any sort of advantage by shoving fuel into their cars as quickly as possible, and surely it did not go so well. What they were doing was extremely dangerous, especially since some teams were using something closer to rocket fuel than normal petrol to power their cars. The FIA recognized this and banned refueling the following year. With the refueling ban of 1984 onwards, the strategic focus shifted away from radical fueling strategies and into the conservation of fuel and tires throughout the race. Up to this point, pit stops were still usually long and chaotic, with none of the choreography and synchronization of today's pit stops. But now more than ever, pit stops had to be done quickly to lose as little time as possible with the car stopped and get back onto the track. By 1993, Benetton has set a new world record for the fastest ever pit stop at the Belgian Grand Prix, with a time of just 3.2 seconds. It may not seem very quick by today's standards, but back then, pit stops were between 4 and 7 seconds. They were able to achieve this mind-blowingly fast record because of the continued efforts that were put into not only making the pit stops faster by further developing technologies like the quick release jack and more powerful wheel guns, but by also adding more people to the pit stop crew, giving each of them a unique and individual task to focus on, making the whole thing go by faster and, more importantly, smoother. So for instance, 2 jackmen, one in the front and one in the back, 2 tire carriers and a gunner for each tire. The gunner unscrews the wheel nut, the worn tire is removed. Then the new one is fitted by the second carrier. Then the wheel nut is screwed back in, the car is lowered, and away it goes. Towards the end of 1993, the FIA decided it was time to spice up the show and mix things up a little bit after a few years of Williams' domination. Their 1992 car, the Williams FW14B, which is still considered to be one of the most technologically advanced Formula 1 cars of all time. Yes, even today. It had all sorts of driver aids to help it go faster. Most notably, a clever active suspension and a brilliant traction control system that made it pretty much unbeatable, running 2 or more seconds faster per lap and finishing races minutes ahead of everybody else. The FIA did 2 things. First, they issued a ban on electronic driver aids such as traction control, active suspension, ABS, launch control, automatic transmissions, and just to be safe, 4-wheel steering, in the hopes of holding back teams like Williams and avoid their total domination like seen in 1992 and a part of 1993. And second, they brought back refueling just to make sure races were more exciting. This signaled the beginning of a new strategic sprint era in Formula 1. Once again, there was a change of focus. With refueling being now officially unbanned, the focus shifted away from the conservation of fuel and tires back into the pit stop strategies and battles. The very first of which came from the first race featuring the new regulations in 1994, again in Brazil. Michael Schumacher was unable to pass Ayrton Senna out on the track, but managed to get ahead of him during his pit stop for fuel, which was just quick enough for him to come back out into the lead.
Oh, and Schumacher is out first! Schumacher has taken the lead in the pits! Whoa!
Wow.
Throughout the rest of the 90s, Ferrari in particular was able to use very light fuel loads to beat their rivals when outright pace simply wasn't enough. Michael Schumacher managed to beat McLaren at the 1998 Hungarian Grand Prix because Ferrari used an innovative 3-stop strategy, where he ran insanely light throughout the race, but did so with enough margin to make an extra stop. Interesting fact, the fuel load of a car is considered to be one of the biggest factors impacting its overall speed in comparison to others. And when teams were given the opportunity to play with this as they wanted, it opened up a whole new range of strategic possibilities. With refueling being back, pit stop times no longer depended on the time it took to change tires, but on the time it took to fill up with fuel. They usually lasted between 6 and 12 seconds, depending on the amount of fuel being pumped into the car. Again, the entire strategy was based on how much fuel, how much time you spend with the car stopped, versus how long you can run without stopping. How much heavier or lighter are you willing to go in order to win? All of this made into a great strategic battles between teams and their different pit stop times. They were obviously quite a bit longer than just with changing tires, and that also means that teams were constantly working hard to make these pit stops faster and faster, to make their strategies work. This time around, the fueling rig was regulated and deemed safe to use by the FIA. But even so, during the following years, Formula 1 went through its fair share of fires and refueling issues, mainly because the problem was still the same. They were shoving fuel into the car as quickly as it was physically possible, using extremely high compression to speed it up even more. A couple of notable accidents were those of Jos Verstappen's Benetton during the 1994 German Grand Prix, that burst into flames after the fuel rig malfunctioned and sprayed fuel all over the car and the mechanics. It was then ignited because of the heated brake disc, injuring several people. Another one happened to Felipe Massa's Ferrari during the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, when he drove off while his fueling hose was still attached after a release error. Things were looking grim for the refueling enthusiasts.
Let me play a sad song for you on the world's smallest violin. This is serious. I know. This really is the world's smallest violin. See?
Towards the end of the 2009 season, it was announced that refueling would be once again banned from racing, along with other cost-cutting measures in the hopes of making Formula 1 more financially sustainable. The new show was all about overtaking cars out on the track, not in the pit lane. And so began the quote boring years of Formula 1, where they had to introduce things like the DRS, the drag reduction system mounted on the rear wing, in order to facilitate overtaking on the track. And once again, there will be new regulations in 2019 in an effort to make the bodywork simpler and with more drag, so that chasing cars down and overtaking them would be even easier. But let's not lose our focus here, the pit stops. With the new regulations now prohibiting refueling during the race, pit stops were faster than ever. By 2012, teams were regularly breaking the 3-second mark, and by 2013, just 3 years after the return of quick pit stops, Red Bull had lowered the record time to just under 2 seconds. In 2016, this record was again broken by Williams during the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, with a staggering time of 1.92 seconds. How are they able to achieve such times? Well, 2 things: investment and practice. Since 2010, a lot of money has been invested in perfecting pit stop technologies and improving them where they could. Innovations such as the pivoting jack, which allows the front jackman to step out of the way before he lowers the car, and design changes to the wheel nuts and guns continue to shave fractions of a second off stop times, making them ever so slightly faster. There's a popular military saying that goes, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast," meaning that truly fast repeatable actions must be smooth, but you cannot perform a smooth action fast if you cannot first perform a slow action smoothly. That is why pit stop practices are so important. Teams practice pit stops hundreds of times in order to get it right come race day. Here's a real-life example of what practice can do. If the driver comes in a very predictable straight line and slows down in a uniform, consistent manner, as practice, the gunner will follow the wheel nut as the car approaches and unscrew the nut while the car is still stopping. If everything goes well, the car will be lifted, the wheel nut will be undone, and the tire ready to be pulled out before the car fully stops. So if you think about it, pit stops actually begin before the car ever stops. And all of this is possible because of loads of practice. After all, smooth is fast. Until next time, these were just Racer Thoughts.